Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Bioinformatics unit. This is, I'm really delighted to get to teach this unit each year for UWC. This is my second year doing this now. And I am involved in a lot of the other modules that take part through the course of this year. As Bronwyn mentioned, I will be teaching bioinformatics as part of the next generation sequencing module. I also will be teaching 3 lectures on proteomic identification, quantitation, and structure as part of this year's proteomics module. And for the 3rd year running, we're going to offer our module on clinical biomarkers. I believe that's in August, if I'm not mistaken. So I hope that lots of you will be interested in that as well. For today, I want to get started with a whole lot of computer science concepts that show up all over the place in bioinformatics. A lot of this is going to seem like, I'm not taking a computer science course, why am I seeing this in a biotechnology route? But I have to tell you, almost all biotechnology today relies upon algorithms to make sense of those data, to make the information in our experiments accessible to us. So a lot of these concepts that show up today are going to matter to you in your research. But today we have really 4 major concepts that we're spanning across, and I want to make sure that we all kind of get that gestalt in mind from the word go. So we start with metadata. People often describe this as data about data, which I think is maybe a little less than informative, but we'll try to describe it as the context by which we can interpret the data from an experiment. The context for interpretation. Now there's a fairly extended section of this talk that discusses how computers represent information at a very low level. How do we represent characters in a computer? How do we represent images in computers? These things are very important for us to understand, so we're going to cover this bit mapping to information relationship. Compression often shows up in biotechnology, especially as we get to instruments like next generation sequencing and so on. I tend to call it massively parallel sequencing, so if I use those 2 terms, they just mean the same thing to me. Certainly, if we talk about even mass spectrometry data, the area where I got my PhD, the data volumes that we're working with are pretty big. It's very typical that a biotechnology experiment knocks out a gigabyte of data from a single experiment. A gigabyte. A lot of us are using laptops that have 256 gig hard drives in them. Well, you've already lost 1/256th of your space just from one experiment. And if you have 15 experiments in each of 2 cohorts, you can see that's a pretty big block of information. So compression is a natural thing for us to be talking about. And for just a brief moment, we're going to talk about computational efficiency. This might seem entirely arbitrary and off topic, but I have to say, bioinformatics has been one of those workspaces where having an efficient algorithm, one that can run even when your data are very large, is frequently more valuable to everyone than having a provably correct algorithm that takes multiple days to run. So we'll try to talk about some of the key concepts of big O as we get to this last part. Okay, so we're going to start with metadata. How do we describe the data that we have? Metadata are experimental descriptions. I think most of you have at this point seen at least one scientific paper, and you've probably noticed that these papers typically have a materials and methods section. And those materials and methods sections are really important because all people who are supporting public funding for science believe that science should be reproducible. That if I do an experiment, I describe that experiment well enough, not just the findings, but how I did it, that somebody else could repeat that experiment in their own labs. So materials and methods are a big deal, and metadata are one of the principal ways that we communicate that. If you don't have a sufficient description of your metadata, your result is not really something that can be contextualized properly. If you present a p-value, for example, and don't say anything about what statistical testing you use to get to that p-value, the p-value is basically a voodoo number. We need to be able to express not just in terms of what we did on the bench to get our result, but what we did with the data afterwards. I will not tell you how many times I've gone to a master's defense or a PhD defense where I ask the question, where did this p-value come from? And I hear someone say, well, that's what the statistician did. You, as graduate students, will be responsible for understanding all parts of your research well enough to justify the decisions that were made. Being able to contextualize these results is part of the metadata that we must produce as part of our science. Of course, we mentioned that we need to be able to replicate our science. We need to be able to repeat experiments in a different laboratory and come up with a comparable result. Metadata are essential for this and for understanding its outputs. If you do an experiment and come up with data, but you don't have the process that led to those data or the process that led to that analysis, it's wasted effort on your part. You've lost the time that went into that because that result is not usable. It's wasted money because somebody had to pay for the reagents, they had to pay for the computation time, etc. Waste is not something that we have a lot of room for at this point. Everyone knows that the economy right now is a little sluggish. People are cutting back investment in public science. As a result, we have to be very, very good stewards of the money and the time that we have available to us. So I want to propose a scenario. If you're relatively new in the graduate track, I think most of you, so I would just point out that many of you have not gotten accustomed to the oddities of professor behavior. Professors are weird people, aren't they? Right, so I would just submit that it is not unusual for a graduate student to be given a collection of data by a new principal investigator, another professor, and said, look, the postdoc who did all these experiments has taken an assistant professorship job in Germany. And now we have these data and we need to get this paper out. Do it. This will happen at some point in your career. That is a very difficult kind of experimental task to take on because the things that the postdoc knew about how these experiments came about is frequently not recorded in a lab notebook, is not written in a handy README file that accompanies the text files. And frequently, as a new professor somewhere, they're way too busy to answer emails, and the professor for whom the postdoc was working probably didn't retain all the details of the conversations he or she had with that postdoc. So if you were to receive files on a hard disk that said, I'm file DT-Vile85 and DT-Vile23 and DT-Vile59 and 5 and 93 and 26, as shown here, how would you, if you knew that this was a two-cohort study, it may be a wild type versus mutant result, at base you would want to know which of these files relates to which of the two cohorts. If you haven't got that information, you're in a world of hurt. This is exactly the case where metadata make all the difference on Earth. Trust me, it's a common scenario. All right. Now, a lot of people, as I understand it, are taking a lot of photographs in public these days. You'll see people pointing the camera at a high angle, right? This might show my bald spot a little bit, but okay. I snap my photo and there we go. That's great. Now, at a moment, how many people in this room have location services turned on your phone? Like everybody? Wow! Okay. Well, what you don't know is that every JPEG image that your cell phone is writing to its flash is covered in metadata. You might be accustomed to having, the photograph there, and you think, well, that's great. I think many people know that the photograph will typically record the time and date on which it was taken. But if you have location services turned on, many cameras will write the GPS coordinates right into the data file. Now, I took this one with my camera. I'm one of those old school dudes who actually uses a camera rather than a cell phone camera. But just look at all this information that got stored along with this image. This, by the way, is Tigerberg Hospital, and that is the building where I work normally, right across the rail yard here. So we see that we have the camera model is there. So somebody who's looking at this JPEG file knows Professor Tab at the time was using a Canon EOS M2. You can see what type of lens I was shooting, whether I had the flash turned on, autofocus mode, all of this stuff. That's not personally identifying information. But with each selfie you take in each bathroom, the GPS coordinates of that bathroom are likely being recorded to that selfie. And somebody who's digging through your Instagram can figure out where you've been, where you spend your time. It's true. When I go home to visit my folks somewhere near Kansas City, Missouri, I have to be really careful that I don't keep location services turned on my phone, because if I snap a photo of their driveway and post it to Google Photos, I could discover that that's now on the Google Photos as a location where that photo was taken. I tell you, my parents don't like publicity. They probably resent that I've just mentioned them here. All right. Now, a lot of times you will hear about something called minimal information standards, and often called like Miami or MIAPI, depending on what area you're working within. So this is minimum information about a microarray experiment. But you can see that there's a world of minimum information standards that are out there. Open science is a big deal. FAIR principles are a big deal. And increasingly, your ability to publish your work depends upon your ability and your willingness to make your data publicly available. But many of the repositories to which you are required to publish your data don't just allow you to use it as the great file server in the sky, right? You don't just dump a huge bolus of NGS FASTQ files onto the server and then you're done. Instead, you must provide metadata. That will be reflected in your manuscript saying, data for this publication are available under PXD blah, 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 or European Nucleotide Archive blah, 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 or these were placed in the Geo repository under accession such and such, right? So your ability to get that number, which is frequently required for you to submit a paper, requires that you're able to describe sufficiently, meeting a minimal information standard, how you produced those data. Again, this is metadata just written in a different context. Minimum information describes the bare bones set of things you must know about these data before they are accepted by the repository. Okay, so we've talked then about metadata in the context of EXIF, which is something many of you may have never heard of. But every time you write a JPEG file, you're probably also writing the metadata in EXIF format. We've talked about minimum information standards as a way to specify the bare bones minimum that must be described about an experiment before it can be posted. I'm going to take a quick sip. One of the other things you'll learn about me is that I like tea very much. Helps keep me calm. All right. Now, let us talk about this problem of representing things other than numbers in binary format. I think lots of people have heard somebody mutter something darkly about how the only thing computers can know about is 1 and 0. You hear stuff like that. But what does that mean? Well, typically, we are making use of computers that store information in an on or off representation. That you have some circuit that has a high voltage to represent that this bit is turned on, or a low voltage to represent that this bit is turned off. All right. That's fine if what you're trying to store is a yes-no kind of result. The bit is on if it's yes, or the bit is off if it's no. But generally speaking, we're trying to store information that's a little more complex than that. One of the most frequent types of representations that we try to do, for example, is to store letters. But to get to letters, we really need to have some way to represent numbers. So before I described a bit as a thing that can be on or off, in practice, we typically think of bits in collections of 8. All right, so if you put 8 bits together, you have what we call a byte. Right? So if you could imagine then that our 8 bits are all turned on, each of those bits is going to represent a different magnitude. Now this is quite similar to how we deal with things in decimal numbers. So if I give you the number 5, you say to yourself, well, that's equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a count of 5 things, right? But what happens if I move that 5 one position to the left and follow it with a 0? Now it's 5, 0. Do you see how the 5 all by itself has a very different value than if we put a 0 behind it? Right. That's because in a decimal system, every position to the left that number moves, its value rises by 10. In binary, we don't have 10 different values that can appear at each position, 0 through 9. Instead, we have just 0 and 1. So instead, if we have a 1 in binary all by itself, it's equal to 1. If you follow it with a 0, its value doubles to be 2. If you follow it by 2 zeros, its value becomes 4. If you follow it by 3 zeros, it becomes 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. You see how that works? All right. So when we look at a 1 all by itself or with any number of zeros in front of it, its value is 1. If we scoot it one position to the left, its value is 2. In this case, we're doing the numbers in sequence. So here we've got a bunch of zeros followed by 1, 1. In this case, the value of 11 in binary is 3, because this one has carries a weight of 2, this one has a weight of 1. Added together, they're 3. The value 4 is just a 1 followed by 2 zeros. So you can see that the patterns that build out from this allow us, using just 2 different symbols at each position, 0 or 1, to represent any number arbitrarily. Now, I would point out that the maximum value you can get for any one byte, an unsigned byte in this case, is to turn on every one of the bits in that byte. And together, those have a value of 255. So that is, as I said, an unsigned byte. In some cases, you would probably want to represent sign in here as well, so that you can represent negative as well as positive numbers, in which case you get a number that centers on 0 rather than one that starts at 0. Minor point. But what I want you to carry away from that is that binary representations of numbers allow us to use combinations of many bits to make rather larger numbers from them. This is, as I mentioned, an unsigned byte. We often will see a character represented as 1 byte as well, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide, something we call ASCII. Sometimes we have to represent larger numbers than this. Imagine if you're writing counts in an ecology data set, for example, and you're counting birds, right? So you have grackles or crows or ravens or whatever flying around. I once had to do this in the evening in my ecology class in college. I have to say, my ability to tell a grackle from a raven is abysmal. But let's imagine that I'm an expert counter and I'm counting how many are coming in and out of this tree at a given point in time. Well, tap, 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 tap. I'm making all my little tallies in my notebook. I still have this notebook, by the way. And what happens if I get to bird number 256? If I'm using 1 byte to represent those counts? I'm out of bits, right? So we tend to glue bytes together into 2 byte or 4 byte numbers. Goodness me, I'm drying right up today. Okay, so if you glue 2 bytes together, you now have 16 bits to make that decision. If you glue 4 bytes together, you have 32 bits to work with. And all of these work much the same way. Things get really messy when you're trying to store a number like pi. Everyone remembers pi? 3.14159, right, okay. The number just keeps going. So if you're trying to store a number like pi, you could use a float. In a case like that, we have 1 bit that's used to represent sign, 8 bits that are used to represent the exponent, if I remember correctly, and 23 bits that represent the digits of the number in general. Right, so floating point numbers, where you have something like the Avogadro's number. Do people remember Avogadro? Moles, right, so 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd power. Right, something like that is a float number. So we're able to store those in another format that stores the part including the decimal point in one place and the exponent in another place. So gluing together lots and lots of bits, figuring out how to divvy them up properly, gives us a lot of power for representing numbers with just 1s and 0s. Good? Okay. Right, so we spend a lot of time thinking in decimal. Here we have representations in binary. So before I was just showing you, I think, numbers 1 through 8 or something. Here we have 0 through 16. And you see that at the top we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, that's odd. I wonder why they chose 7. That's all right. But we have 7 bits here being shown to represent how this decimal number appears in binary. And over here, we have yet another way that we represent this. This is called hexadecimal. Hexadecimal. Frequently, computer scientists find that writing long strings of zeros and ones is a really inefficient way of communicating a bit pattern. And it's a whole lot easier if you can do so by representing it in hexadecimal. Now, in binary, only 2 values can appear at any one position, 0 or 1. In decimal, what we count with every day, how many different values can appear at one position? I hear some 9, I hear some 2, but I'm not hearing the number decimal. Decimal? 10. Right. So you might think to yourself, when I'm looking at a particular number just written down willy-nilly by a non-computer scientist, I only see the numbers like 1 through 9, but you're forgetting a really important one, an invention by the Indian civilization, actually. 0. Do you know how long humanity went without a value for 0? Long time. Long time. Indians revolutionized math when they gave us the 0. It's a fascinating story. I'm actually picking up a book on it when I'm back in the States. I'm really excited about the book. But 0 through 9 are 10 different symbols that we use in decimal. But in hexadecimal, we don't limit ourselves to just those 10 numbers, numerals, I should say. Instead, we add A through F. Sneaky, huh? So 0,9 is the same thing as decimal 9. 0A is the same thing as decimal 10. 0B is the same thing as 11, 12, 13, 14. Oh, I've gotten myself off, haven't I? What am I doing? Oh, no, that's right. Okay. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 is 0F. And then finally, 10 in hexadecimal has the same value as 16 in decimal. So you can treat whatever symbol you want as a numeral. And hexadecimal versus binary versus decimal have different conventions of which set of characters may appear at a given position to represent a number. Hexadecimal 10 is equal to 16 in decimal because we have extra possible letters that can appear in the place of these numerals. Why would they choose this rather than this, for example? Because ones and zeros are not very compact. And if you're trying to write a number like 255 in binary, you end up writing 8 ones. But what would 255 be in hexadecimal instead? FF, exactly. So it gives us the ability to represent sets of 4 bits as one letter or number. Weird but true. Okay, so I wouldn't want you guys to be confused if you run across hexadecimal or binary representations in your work with bioinformatics. On occasion, you're going to need to remember that sometimes A through F are numerals. All right. That brings us to characters. Computers do not have an internal way that obviously this byte represents a particular letter. Now, I grew up in, say, the late 70s and 80s, and I was living in the United States, so you can imagine the Cold War was really big on my mind. And oddly, Europe and America had collaborated on creating things like ASCII for representing characters, but there's an entirely different character set used in Russia, right? So Russia uses Cyrillic lettering, not Latin. As a result, the way that Russian computers map a given number from a byte to a particular letter is completely different from the way it was done in the United States. These days, you could opt to write a letter in Arabic in Microsoft Word if you had the right language packs installed, right? Arabic is a much more complex language to represent in a lot of ways than our unaccented English letters. So today, we'll find some very complex technologies used for representing letters with numbers, things like Unicode. I'm not going to try to explain Unicode. I'm going to try to focus on something much more basic, just ASCII, just ordinary old ASCII. So in this case, we want to represent in a byte letters that we use in the English language. I would note that a lot of people wanted to record other symbols as well. And we're going to talk about a couple of them. But we note that when we write English text, we have more than 26 possibilities for what appears at any given position. To start with, we have capital letters and small letters, right? So we need to be able to represent with a byte whether this is a capital A or a lowercase a. That's a pretty good requirement. But we also have a lot of punctuation and numbers that actually appear in the course of our writing. So you can see here that if I want to write a capital A, I'm going to use the value 65. Now you might say, where did I get 65? So let's try to walk through this. Remember that in hexadecimal, we have 16 values that can appear in each symbol. So here we have 16 different possibilities, 16 different possibilities, 16 different possibilities, and we have 8 stripes of them. So we have a whole byte to work with here. All right. So in this case, we are in the 5th column, which is headed with a 4. 4 times 16 is 64. And we're 1 row down, which makes that 65. So we can figure out that A is 65 by noticing it's in the column labeled 4 and the row starting with 1. 4 times 16 plus 1 gives us 65. That's how this table is constructed. All right. Now, of course, we have more than just letters that we want to represent. Frequently, we want to include a space. In this case, space is in the 2nd column, which means 2 times 16, and it's all the way at the top of the row. So its value is 32. So if you were looking at this number, this array of bytes as unsigned integers, you might see something like a byte representing 65, followed by a byte representing 32. If you were to show those as numbers, that would be 65 followed by 32. If, on the other hand, you were interpreting that as a string of characters, string is an important word. We use that all the time to represent a whole series of letters, basically. If you had 65 followed by 32, and you knew that this was an ASCII string, you would interpret that as the letter capital A followed by a space. So the numbers as stored in the computer do not by themselves tell you whether it's a series of numbers or a string, but the metadata associated with it should. That if you have created this as a string in your programming language, then you know to interpret this as ASCII. Okay, a couple characters that we really need to talk about. One is this HT symbol here. Frequently in computer science, you're going to see it described as \T. This is one of the things that's going to show up in our R code later in the week. So when you see \T, it means there's a tab separating things. That you may have some desire to make the columns line up in a text file where all the values in the first column appear above each other, and then there's some amount of white space, and then you start the next column of things. Frequently, tab is used to represent that. Down here we have line feed and carriage return. I don't imagine many of you have now seen a line printer. Line printers were really popular and useful back in the 1970s and 80s. Actually, my first printers at home were the dot matrix printers, which are kind of their inheritors. So when we communicate text to a line printer, we're trying to make it appear on the piece of paper. So carriage return was the signal that said, now that you're done, and now that you're at the end of this line, we want you to return the print head to the start of the line. That's the carriage return. We also want you to turn the roll of paper up one line so that we're ready to print on the next line. That is a line feed.
Like a typewriter.
Like a typewriter, exactly, yeah. In this case, we have something that moves the platen all the way to the other end, that's the carriage return, and the line feed actually advances to the next row. So those two are separated in the space of ASCII. So ASCII represents a really, really standard way that we make our numbers expressed in bytes mapped to letters and to some non-printable characters as well. There are things like bell in here. I believe it's right here. This is actually not a printable character in any sense, but when the computer is asked to play, to show on screen that character, its job was to ring a bell instead. So if you're ever playing a big text file back and the computer beeps at you, it's probably encountered one of those characters. Just odd little artifacts. So there are lots of control characters in here alongside these other types of representations. Okay, so I've asked you to take in a lot of information there. Binary, decimal, hexadecimal. I've asked you to sometimes just take it on faith that this byte is intended to be shown as a character instead via ASCII. And now we're going to turn that over on its head one more time. What if what we're storing in our bytes is not a number and it's not a letter, but it's intended to represent a brightness instead? I think most of us at some point have worked with a JPEG or a GIF or a PNG. There was a time when these things existed long in advance of meme graphics on Facebook and Instagram, I guess. But anyway, back in the day, we would sometimes see 8-bit graphics formats used. Things like GIF. GIF, do people here call it GIF?
Yes.
Really? It's a GIF? Oh. I've stepped into a holy war, I'm sorry. I'm going to say GIF because that's who I am. But you'll also often see things called PNG, or Portable Network Graphic, PNG files. Lots of different formats. All of the, or TIFF, that's kind of one of the great granddaddies of them all. These are what we call bitmap formats. I want you to imagine for a moment that we have an 8-bit monochrome image. Okay, so it's just in shades of gray, from purest white to darkest black. And what we're going to use is 1 byte to represent how bright, or sorry, how dark. Well, what are we doing here? I have to remember the polarity on this. I believe that the high numbers here represent white, and the lowest numbers here represent dark. Okay, so if you were using an 8-bit monochrome representation of the image, each dot, each pixel in this case, each combination of X and Y value is going to be represented by 1 byte. So if you have 1,000 dots across and 1,000 dots tall, how many pixels do you have?
Maybe.
1,000 by 1,000
Yeah.
is how many?
Maybe.
Million.
Yeah.
A million. Okay, great. So what you've just rediscovered in thinking through it is the megapixel, right? So if you had a 1 megapixel image that was 1,000 dots across and 1,000 dots tall, and we're going to store how bright each location is in 1 byte, how big is the uncompressed image?
What? Can you repeat the question?
Okay, we have 1,000 columns and 1,000 rows. Each coordinate is being stored in 1 byte. So how big is the uncompressed image? 1 megabyte. Very nice. Well done. Okay, so we have a million pixels in a 1,000 by 1,000 image. Each one is a byte. Therefore, we have a 1 megabyte uncompressed image. Okay, so each of those brightness levels is then going to be represented by some number represented in binary up to 255 or down to 0. Okay, now that's brilliant. That means that each color's fidelity, from your eyes, is going to be pretty good, right? That if this spot is a little bit brighter, it might move from a 64 to a 65. Your eye might be able to tell that difference. Most eyes, I would say, are probably sensible to about that level, but not much further. If I take a photograph with my Canon, I'm actually shooting at 14 bits of brightness at each location in the picture, and at considerably more than 1 megapixels. The reason for this is that when I snap the picture, I might be overexposed or I might be underexposed, and the camera wants to be able to tell me which 8 bytes are the best choice to represent this picture. It's kind of sneaky, but I'm sorry, minor point. I like photography. So let us now imagine that these pixels are going to be representing not just grayscale, but full glorious color. And how do you do that? Our eyes do not have receptors for every possible color. In fact, some of us in this room are colorblind. Just by stats, I feel very safe saying that. And if you're colorblind, you may lack one of the receptors that most other people have for detecting color. So, in general, computer scientists have found that we don't have to be able to express every possible color so very faithfully, so long as we get the right combination of red light, green light, and blue light, RGB, right? So, instead of considering this as a black and white image, let's return to our 1000 by 1000 pixel image. And this time we're going to store it in color instead. So I'm going to have 1 byte to say how red this is, 1 byte to say how green this is, and 1 byte to say how blue this is. If I want to make that pixel white, I'm going to have the red all the way to the top, the green all the way to the top, and the blue all the way to the top. Great. So now, instead of storing 1 megabyte for our 1 megapixel image, I now must store 3 megabytes, because the red and the green and the blue are each being stored in 256 levels, 1 byte apiece. All right, great. That's how we do bitmapped graphics in most computer science. Now, if you're downloading something like a JPEG, JPEG has all kinds of compression in it. So instead of using 3 megabytes for just a 1 megapixel color image, we can store much larger images with much greater color fidelity, for that matter, using a lot of compression techniques. Okay. Now, does it matter if we use 1 full byte to represent color intensity? In this case, we're going to start with the simple case here, our 1-bit color representation. Imagine if instead of storing each brightness as a 0 to 255 number, we were instead storing it as a 0 or a 1. Now the way that we always end up representing that is in black and white. That we have, in this case, we map the value 1 to a black dot and the number 0 to a white dot. Does this image convey information? Yeah, but we don't like it very much. Yeah. Light, as we perceive it, has a lot of gradations between fully dark, fully light and fully dark. So what if we instead use 2 bits? Now we already said that a 1-bit representation is either black or white, and there's no in-between anymore. When we go to 2 bits, how many possible brightness levels can we represent? So we can think that through. They could both be 0, they could be 0, 1, they could be 1, 0, or they could be 1, 1. Everyone sees that, right? So that's 4 possible outcomes for each spot. Here we had only 2 possible outcomes, on or off. Here we have 4 possible outcomes. When we go to 3-bit, how many possible levels do we have? 8. Right, so we can have black, white, and 6 shades in between. When we move up to 4 bits, we now have 16 possible levels of brightness. So again, we're getting more and more lifelike. As we move to 6-bit, what are we up to? 64. Right, so if you have 7 bits, you can have 128 different values. When you get to 8-bit, which is kind of the typical way we go, you have 256 different levels of brightness for each dot. So our ability to represent the gradations of light in these grayscale images greatly increases by just adding another few bits to this. And by the time you get to 8 bits, you're frequently at the good enough level. Okay. Now, compression is kind of a wild topic, and I just feel that it's important that you understand something that happens when you use a zip file, or when you use a 7Z file, or an ARG, or a BZ2, or a GZ. There's a world of different formats out there that you're going to work with along the way. I would like you to be able to recognize some of the most common file formats that come into play, like these. And I'd like you to have some notion of how we allow for compression of data in computer science. Because, as I said, this is ridiculously common in biotechnology. Okay. So, lots of times you will do, for example, a next generation sequencing experiment or a mass spectrometry experiment, and you'll get back a big blob of data. Or, heaven help you, maybe you're doing imaging. If you're doing like live imaging and storing video of what's happening in fluorescent microscopy, the data that you're producing is in really large volumes. Okay, we would like to use the smallest number of bits or bytes possible to represent the original content. Now, I've kind of left aside something that's going to be a really big deal in a moment, which is how reversible is this compression? You might think compression must always be able to be reversed, that we always want to get back exactly what we put into our zip file or whatever we put into the GZ or the BC2 or whatever. Lots of file formats support that. That is lossless compression. Very frequently, however, we're willing to tolerate some loss in fidelity in order to do that, to represent it more compactly. And the key example of this is music. When you listen to music on your iPod, the sound has been very heavily compressed versus what you would get if you bought the CD. But frequently, your ear can't tell. So this is a case of where loss in compression is actually acceptable. All right. Anything else I want to say on this? You will sometimes see files coming from Unix computer users that are like .tar, .gz, and a lot of people, I think, have the impression that means that tar means compression. It doesn't actually. Tar is a way to make a whole bunch of files into one file prior to compression. So if you see a tar GZ file, the tar itself just stuck everything together, the GZ compressed it. But how does that work? All right, I want you to imagine first the case of run length encoding. This is one of the, this is a technology that underlies a whole lot of what we do with compression. So I would point out that in this vector, I have a whole bunch of A values, A, so that's 8 of them, B, 6 of them, and CC, 2 Cs. So in this case, a quick way to compress this value down is to record that I started with A's, of which there were 8, then I continued to B's, of which there were 6, followed by C's, of which there were just 2. So you can see that before, we had to store 16 values to store the explicit vector of symbols. But after run length encoding, we were able to store all of that information in just 6 bytes. So that's a considerably reduced string. This is most frequently used in stuff like GIFs, for example. GIFs do not allow a huge number of colors for each dot. They only allow up to 256 colors in the entire image. So if you ever take a photograph and try saving it as a GIF, you probably notice that you lost a lot of color fidelity. The reason for that is that it's trying to use the best palette of 256 colors to represent that. But one benefit of doing so is that in a GIF, you can frequently say, I have the same color appearing in a whole series of different pixels. right? So if you take a photograph of the sky, the particular blue I get at that position is not very different from what I have at the next dot over. Yes?
So, Professor, like, how does the computer know, like, the different shades of blue are still blue?
In this case, the answer is mapping. As I said, this is frequently used in GIF, where there are only 256 colors used overall. So if the same pattern of bytes is used for these two successive colors, if they're mapped to the same color in the palette, then it simply needs to store this particular shade of blue was used for 2 or 5 consecutive dots. Yeah. I haven't talked about how we do like best palette selection and stuff like that, but it's kind of beyond the scope of things. But yeah, in this case, being able, imagine in a black and white image, right? You're very rarely going to have an image where black and white are alternating every pair of pixels. Instead, you're likely to have kind of maybe a white background against which a black object appears. So there's going to be huge swaths of the space where you have long runs of white pixels and probably quite a few where you have runs of black pixels as well. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about a great example of compression, and that is the English language. The English language is rife with patterns that, with letters that are used more frequently than others. So I borrowed this information from the Concise Oxford English Dictionary. The URL for it is down here. And here I've dumped it into Excel to make it a little easier to follow. Now, has anyone here watched Wheel of Fortune or played Hangman? Okay, right. In the United States, watching Wheel of Fortune was something we used to do after dinner. So they would have a phrase or something, and Pat Sajak would ask the contestant, "All right, give me a letter," and the person would say, "I want an H," and then Vanna White would come and turn over each of those letters. Okay, well, sorry. If you watch American TV, that's going to make lots of sense. I guess not if you're not. But in Hangman, it's quite the same thing. So if you guess a letter that is yet to be turned over in the phrase, then you get to write in your H's and you feel very good about it. But if you call out H and there is no H in the phrase, you draw another part of the hangman, right, to get closer and closer to losing the game. Right. So you can see, looking at Oxford English Dictionary, that E is the most common letter in English language, using all the letters in the dictionary as your guide. And we see that E shows up more than 10% of the time. If you're just pointing to a random letter in the dictionary, you're going to hit an E more than 10% of the time, which is quite astonishing considering that we have 26 letters. So let's say you had 25 letters and they were uniformly used. They were as likely to appear as each other. How frequently would you expect a given letter to appear if there were no bias in which letter was most common, if you had 25 letters? Equally, yes. If each letter appeared with equal frequency, what would that frequency be? If you had 25 letters.
Let me see, there's 4 somewhere in there.
1 in 25, 4%.
There we go.
Very nice. All right, so if you had 25 letters and each was used at the same frequency, then this would be flat, and it would be flat right here at 4%. All right. So any deviation way up or way down is a way in which the English use of letters is non-uniform. And E is this really outstanding case because it is well and truly more popular than anything else than A, right? So we already know that vowels kind of get preference. So E and A are the two most heavily used letters. Meanwhile, down here at the bottom end, we've got X, Z, J, and Q. Well, they're just kind of underperforming here. I mean, this is weird. Languages were not designed, right? So our use of letters is something that's evolved over time. And this deviation from the norm tells us that E is used far more frequently than something like J or Q. In compression, that represents an advantage because it means that if you can use fewer bits to represent E than you do something like J or Q, you can save a lot of space as you try to compress language. So how does that work? Oh, I love this figure. I won't tell you how long I spent trying to make this figure. This is another representation of what we were just looking at. Trust me on that. We have done something called neighbor joining here. Do you remember our underperforming letters? J, Q, X, and Z? Did I say Z earlier? I probably said Z, sorry. Z. All right, so here we have noted that the probabilities for J and Q were the two lowest out of all the letters. And so we created a node that represents either J or Q and joined these two together. Then we said, what are the next two letters that are least most frequently used? X and Z? Okay, we'll join those together and create this XZ node. Then we said, using all the other letters and JQ and XZ, which pairing is least commonly used? And these, one again, JQ, XZ, are then merged together to create one. So you see up at the top, we have A through Z, all of the letters. And now we've split that into these letters being used about half the time, and these letters being used about half the time. Within this set, these get used about half the time, those get used about half the time. This neighbor joining tree has allowed us to represent the letters as a hierarchy, not just as a bunch of independent nodes. How does that work? Well, first off, did anyone spot where E is? It's in a weird spot. It's up high, isn't it? All right. Remember that I said our goal here is to use fewer bits to represent common symbols and more bits to represent rare symbols. All right. So if I want to represent E using this Huffman code, that's what this is called, a Huffman code, I need to remember that I go left, right, left. Does everyone see that? I started at the top of the tree. I went to the BCE blob at the left. I went right to EHMS, and I went left to E. Do you see how each stage there are only two possible outcomes? I either go left or I go right. That's a binary decision, which means that I can represent E as left, right, left, or 0, 1, 0. I'm now going to write E with 3 bits. But what do I have to do to represent something like Z? I've got a 0, a 0, a 0, a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1. I've got a whole bunch of bits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bits to represent Z. So when I report English words using this Huffman code, I'm able to use far fewer bits, but faithfully represent the series of letters that my Huffman tree received. Now, what's missing from this tree? Characters.
And like capital and small letters.
Very good point. So I've already lost the ability to discriminate between a capital or small letter. Anything else I've left out?
Spaces.
Spaces. Obviously, my language is going to look a little squirrely if I record it this way. So I would want to know the relative frequency of spaces along with everything else. Punctuation in general, totally absent. I don't have exclamation points. I don't have hashtags. I mean, my goodness, how am I going to send this out on Twitter? So there we go. But in general, we can start with, we can start with a frequency table like this, work our way to a Huffman code like this, and have a much more compact coding system for describing the way that letters relate to some string. Yes, sir?
So I have to ask, how does it discriminate by like XZ? How does it know if it's an X or a Z?
It adds you add one more byte. One more bit rather. That I give it a 0 if I want an X. I give it a 1 if I give it a Z.
Oh, so it would be like a byte and a bit to have X or Z.
Each transition is a bit.
Yeah.
So 0, 0, 0.
So 9 bits.
1, 1, 1, 1, 1.
Okay.
I think that's 8. Was it 8? Well, whatever, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah, each transition from the top to the bottom. Now, what happens if I give you something that's been compressed with a Huffman code, but I don't give you the tree to interpret it. It's worthless. It's worthless. Everyone's agreed on what ASCII should be. If you give someone a string, they're probably going of numbers and tell them to interpret it as letters, they're probably just going to assume it's ASCII. But in this case, if you've given them a whole string of bits to represent a series of letters, if they don't have this tree to interpret it, you're stuck. I mean, you're not going to be able to interpret it correctly. Plus, you've got these sort of ragged boundaries, right? People are accustomed to receiving a series of bytes. But if I give them the letter E twice, I'm giving them 010, 010, 010, and that's it. That's only 6 bits. So now I'm going to have to pad it out with some other stuff to say, well, you're going to receive 2 bytes using this Huffman code. You're going to have two letters represented by this Huffman code. Stop after that. So, very messy. But very valuable. Huffman codes are used in all kinds of compression algorithms. Okay. Now, frequently, having some data loss as part of this compression is completely acceptable. The folks working in the Joint Pictures experts group, sorry, the JPEG, JPEG actually stands for something. It represents a consortium that got together to say, what's the best way to represent images for the practices of photography and so on. And so JPEG is a format that came out of that. They found that if you change color a little bit, human eyes don't notice. So if you have the color teal and you scoot it over to cornflower blue, well, some people in this room would probably be like, that's completely different. But others would be like, hey, it looks sort of blue-green to me, right? Or cayenne, one of those colors, something like that. We have lots of colors between blue and green that all have distinctive names. Would I be able to tell fuchsia from lavender? Okay, so shifting chrominance, okay, there are a lot of women who are deeply affronted. I'm sorry. Fuchsia and lavender are clearly different colors. I'll just stipulate that. What I'm saying is my eyes suck for that kind of thing. They're very, very bad. So the JPEG folks decided, look, if we need to store an image in a very compact way, it's okay to alter the hue just a little bit, the chrominance, but altering the luminance, the brightness, is much less likely to be acceptable. Okay, so they made this judgment based on a lot of physiologists' conclusions about their eyes. Hopefully they were considering something more than just male eyes, because I gotta say mine stink. All right, so every time you have a bitmap and you elect to save it to a JPEG, the software is approximating the image. So what you write to the file will have some distortions compared to what you were looking at on screen. Now, if you ever need evidence of that, I suggest you take a screenshot from your computer and save it as a JPEG and then blow that thing way up and look at it. What you're going to see is a whole bunch of artifacts that shouldn't be there. And that's because JPEG, as a rule, approximates the image that's on screen in writing that file. Have you ever noticed that a meme graphic that has been passed around for a decade tends to look a little dog-eared? Have a lot of sprinklies and the text is all fuzzy and the colors are pretty approximate? That's because every time somebody has resaved that to their hard drive, the image has gotten reapproximated. And approximating an approximation of an approximation tends to be pretty hairy looking. All right. Part of the mechanism by which that does that is called discrete cosine transform. I don't consider it within the realm of this class that I need to explain how that works because it's complex. But the software is starting by divvying up the image into 8 by 8 blocks, which makes you think to yourself, why are they doing 8 by 8 blocks? And you should immediately say, it's because I'm dealing with computer scientists, and computer scientists think in blocks of 8. So, all right, so DCT is used then to approximate these images, and some of the things that come about are called blocking, ringing, and mosquitoes. You can see some examples of that if you're looking at close to the original here on the left side versus the JPEG approximation that's come out on the right. You can see that there's quite a few places where a smooth gradient of bright to dark has become blocky over at the right. JPEGs are simply not that good at preserving fidelity of the original image. There are lots of cases, though, where using lossy compression is going to make a very big difference. I remember trying to back up my Billy Joel to take with me to my trip to Europe on my laptop in 1994. Okay, that's a long time ago, I appreciate that. But we didn't have the MP3 format just then, at least I wasn't aware of it. And so I ended up trying to find ways to grain up the sound quality so that this file would be small enough to fit onto this minuscule hard drive I had in my lousy laptop. All right. These days, of course, yeah, you just rip out the MP3 right off your CD and everything's fine. Is the MP3 you create from a CD as good a sound as what you get off the original DVD, as original CD? Got some head shakes. My ears don't generally pick it up. But there are some times when I'm compressing like a DVD or something that I'll notice some really weird ringing sound effects in the sound when I do the compression. This is, generally speaking, considered acceptable to lose a little bit of the fidelity to compress it way down. Now, if you were to look at an original TIFF image derived directly from a photographic shot, this is one I had in Ghana, actually. I'm looking at a tiny section of the photo. This is what it looked like in the original TIFF. And even with that very first JPEG save, I see that there's a whole lot of ringing through here. See how this crossbar on the end looks relatively smooth in the original TIFF, but in the JPEG it's got all this weird stair-stepping in it? That's a result of compression. It's a lossy compression that lost fidelity in the original. We worry a lot about freeze-thaw cycles on the bench, in bench experiments. You know, how many times did you take this out of the freezer and thaw it in order to do something with it and then shove it back in the freezer? Because we think that we're losing some fidelity of the biological material with each of that. We should think about the same as we're working with visual data. When we resave a JPEG image, each of those saves potentially is losing fidelity in the original image. All right, one last concept to hit before we close out for this morning. That is big O notation. Big O is one of those topics that causes a lot of people to flunk out of computer science courses, oddly enough. I'm going to try to keep this one as approachable as possible. Let us start with, we'll call it a ball sort. I'm going to use you as our ball sorter. Okay, so you are sitting in a chair, and I am bringing these big bags of balls into the room, and I'm asking you to sort between volleyballs and basketballs. Okay, so your job then is to pick a ball out of the sack, decide which type it is, and put it in this pile or in that pile. If I give you 5 balls, how long does it take to process that job?
Probably like 5 seconds, I don't know.
Okay, so he's giving me a processing rate of 1 hertz. Everyone heard that? I said I'd bring him 5 balls, it would take him 5 seconds to do. That's 1 second per ball. Everyone, okay. Now, if I come into the room with 1,000 balls, does that take, let's assume that you have a whole crew of people who are taking the balls out of the room so you still have room. You're still going to do this 1 ball at a time. Does it take about 1,000 seconds?
Yeah.
No, no.
Okay, so we've got some disagreement on this. He says, yeah, it's going to take that. So what's going to take him longer if I do 1,000,000 decisions rather than 5?
He's going to go nuts.
It's time.
Okay, he's going to get tired. He's going to go nuts. All right.
I'm a byte accident, I don't get tired.
The benefit here is that we're dealing with computers who don't get sleepy and who don't go crazy, except when it's Windows. But, you know, that's just bias speaking. All right. So this is the question of scale, of algorithmic efficiency and scale. So in big O notation, we're trying to capture how much worse things get when the job gets big, right? So what I was describing, when he doesn't get sleepy and doesn't need to stop and eat and doesn't go crazy, is a big O of N task. That whether it's 1,000,000 balls or 5, the process of deciding is this a basketball or is this a volleyball is something he can make in about a second. Right? So we would say that job is a big O of N job. Now, let's talk about some of these curious and crazy things. Now, most of us in computer science like big O of log base 2 of n jobs. And it might seem like that's a very weird scenario. I mean, what would take a log of time in order for you to do?
Learning.
I'm going to give the example of of searching through a sorted list. A sorted list. So I have a number that I'm going to walk into the room, and our decider is going to tell me this is on the list or it's not on the list. You could imagine that he has a list of the numbers that are on his list on a physical list, right? And hopefully he's taken the time to sort them. In the worst case scenario, he hasn't sorted them. He's just got each of the numbers, and he's got to say, all right, is it the first item on the list? It's not. Is it the second item on the list? It's not. Is it the third item on the list? And he keeps going, even if he in fact finds it on the list. That's a stupid algorithm, right? It's a terrible way to do it. So if you were asked this question, is this number or is this number not on your list, you would probably start by sorting your list. Sorting ends up being a big factor in all kinds of bioinformatics algorithms. So we're going to sort the things on our list from the lowest number to the highest number. The next thing is that even if you've got the list sorted, it's not a very good algorithm to say, all right, I'm going to just drop my finger down the list until I hit where that number should be, and then ask, is the number on the list? You see why that's not a great option? Right, because if you're given a high number, you've got to go all the way down to the bottom of the list before you see if it's there or not. So your search time gets worse depending on the values that come in the door. So instead, we frequently see something called a binary search employed. So now when I walk in the room and I say, is 83 on your list? You can start by going to the middle of the list, and then you say, am I higher than 83 or am I lower than 83? If you're higher, you jump halfway to the start of the list and ask that question again. If you're lower, then you go halfway to the bottom of the list and continue. So you can see that this is a bisection search. Bisection, where you're cutting the space in half with each step. Generally speaking, even if your list of numbers that you're having to look through is 1,000 items, a bisection search will get you there in 10 decisions, which is a whole lot faster than having to start at the top of the list and go down every time. So this is an example of log base 2 of n, a binary or bisection search in a binary search tree in our sorted list. We've already mentioned big O of n. This is something where each decision takes exactly the same amount of time to do, and it scales linearly. That's also acceptable in most cases. Log base 2 of n is better. To illustrate a little more clearly why the bisection search is a whole lot better, I want you to imagine that the task is just going to be one thing. I'm going to walk into this door and I'm going to ask him, is this number on the list? And the first time he's going to do it with 10 items on his list. The second time he's going to do it with 100 items on his list. And the third time he's going to do it with 1,000 items on his list. If you time how long it takes him to process each of those lists, you'll see that the time rises with the log of the number of items on his list. Okay. Now, let's talk about big O MN. Probably one of the most common ways that we encounter this is actually with something like homology search. If you're comparing two sequences and asking how to align them, in bioinformatics that's a very common big O of MN option. But imagine that we're doing vector math. Did you guys ever cover matrices and stuff like that back in college? Do we all remember it very well? Maybe not. All right. So I'm going to start by saying we're given two vectors of numbers. I have a row of numbers here, and I've got a column of numbers here. Now I want to fill in a table where each cell represents the product of this value times that value. So I have a list of m items and another list of n items, and we're going to fill in this matrix every time. Do you understand why that is a big O of m times n? Right, because the number of values we have to write in is the product of two input values. And the number of, the size of the table rises with the product of the number of items in M and the number of items in N. Now this last one is a really hairy one. Big O of 2 to the N. So now the amount of time required to optimally solve this problem rises exponentially with the number of items in the roster. There are lots of problems within biotechnology that fall within this big O of 2 to the N. And people really, really dislike doing those in computation. Often you will see people talk about these as NP complete problems, that they're that there's no way to get rid of the exponential cost of running that job. So let's try the example of the shortest possible trip through cities. If we imagine that we're here in Cape Town and we want to visit every city that's in the top 10 of population for South Africa. Okay, well, we agree Johannesburg has got to be on the list, right? We got to have Bloem on the list. I think it falls in the top 10. We need to have, I can't pronounce it properly, the one that's to the west of Johannesburg. Oh, Pretoria, that's up northeast of it. Yeah, Pretoria's got to go on the list, but Ekurhuleni?
Huh?
Ekurhuleni, okay. Now, I don't know if Polokwane is on the top 10 list or not, is it? Okay. Right. Okay, so we see that there's a large number of cities, and if you're trying to create the ideal path that takes you through all 10 of those cities, you can imagine that there are some really bad ways to do it, right? So let's say I put on my list that I'm going to start in Cape Town, and I'm going to proceed immediately to Polokwane, and then I'm going to go to George, and then I'm going to go to Uppington. You see how that's a terrible path, right? These are really long jumps, and I could have done Johannesburg en route to Polokwane, right, and saved myself a lot of trip. So this is sometimes called the traveling salesman problem. If I have only 2 cities and I'm trying to figure out the optimal path between them, no problem, right? I mean, I can plug both of them into Google Maps and be done. If I have 3 cities and I want to figure out the optimal path for passing through the 3 of those to travel the least distance, pretty easy. But when I get to 5 cities or 10 cities, things go completely out the window. The ideal path for seeing all of these places gets to be really squirrely and strange. You end up making these odd zigzags on the map. So the traveling salesman problem is an example of the problem getting worse exponentially with the number of cities that you're including in the map. Many, many problems involving graph theory specifically fall within this category. And that's one of the reasons why they're really fun places to work in bioinformatics, because any progress is considered good progress. We covered a lot of topics, and I appreciate your hanging in there, even though this was a pretty heavily computer science-oriented lecture. These concepts show up everywhere, so I'm really glad that you hung in there. Systems biology today employs bioinformatics for initial pre-processing, follow-on summarization, established knowledge representation, and visualization. It's a wildly complex field that covers a huge number of possible applications. We have done a lot today to talk about how we represent data, how the importance of metadata and being able to track your experiments, being able to communicate to others what you did. We've talked about the importance of compression and talked about 2 key ways that we have enabled it, through run length encoding and through Huffman Codes. We talked a little bit about lossy compression as well. And we've talked about algorithmic complexity. All of these topics will come to bear in every subsequent discussion of bioinformatics. So I'm really glad you hung in there with me. And I would note that at 11 o'clock today, we are starting the first part of the practical side of this module. So we'll be introducing you to the R programming language. Please, if you have not already installed R on your laptop, or you haven't borrowed the laptop from the person you're borrowing it from, please go ahead and have that in place by 11 o'clock. We'll meet right back in here and get started soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.